The wind didn't sound like wind. It carried a low metallic resonance, as if the cold itself vibrated against every surface it touched. Engineers from the U.S. Army Corps stood motionless for a moment, their breath freezing into tiny crystals that drifted sideways, not down. One of them would later describe it as snow behaving like static. To the north, the sky flickered with a pale green aurora. To the south, nothing but darkness, not night, but an absence, an undiscovered void on the map. War planners had predicted that this region wouldn't matter. A remote wilderness. A place untouched by strategy. But after Pearl Harbor, that belief collapsed almost overnight. Japan had taken Attu and Kiska in the Aleutians. The northern flank of the United States, long ignored, suddenly looked exposed, fragile, and, to some officers, frighteningly reachable. And so came the order that no one expected. Build a 2,700-kilometer military highway through uncharted wilderness. 8 months. No excuses. No delays. And, more unsettling, no reliable maps. When Colonel William Hogue read the directive, he reportedly placed his hand on the paper for several seconds. Not in disbelief, but in calculation. He understood what the others feared. Much of the land between Dawson Creek and Fairbanks had never been properly surveyed. Forests dense enough to swallow a convoy. Marshes that turned Earth into a living organism. Ranges where temperatures plunged so fast that engines cracked from thermal shock. And yet, Hogue also knew something else. Something no map showed but every engineer sensed in their bones. If the Japanese advanced further east along the Aleutians, Alaska would be cut off. Without a land route, reinforcement would depend entirely on airfields that froze and ports that iced over like glass. A road was not convenience. It was survival. As the first bulldozers were unloaded in the biting dark, a strange silence fell across the assembled soldiers. Not fear, a kind of mechanical stillness. One of the young engineers noticed that when he spoke, his voice echoed back with a slight delay, as if the cold air processed it before returning the sound. He joked, "It's like the landscape is thinking." The landscape was not thinking, but the war was. And in 8 months, this frozen void would become the greatest engineering race the U.S. Army had ever attempted, built by men who would sometimes advance through territory they couldn't even place on a map. A road through the unknown. A road through the cold. A road built faster than winter could kill it. Before the first tree fell, the United States had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Its northern frontier was a blank spot in its own strategic awareness. Maps of the region existed, yes, but they were products of disparate surveys, incomplete expeditions, and guesswork stitched together with optimistic lines. Some were based on information dating back to World War I. Others contradicted each other so violently that officers joked they described different planets. In early 1942, the strategic concern was mathematical. If Japan advanced east from the Aleutian chain, the United States needed a land route to push troops, fuel, ammunition, and machinery toward Alaska. Ships were vulnerable. Aircraft depended on weather so violent it frequently erased aviation plans for days at a time. A road, even a primitive one, gave Washington a predictable vector of movement. But the scale of the problem was nearly absurd. 2,700 kilometers through dense black spruce forests. Muskeg, a marshy soil that behaved like a sponge on top and a trap beneath. Mountain passes with no confirmed elevation data. Permafrost that shifted from solid to liquid in a matter of hours. Rivers with no bridges and no surveyed depths. Wildlife trails mistaken for valleys. And winter, the silent antagonist. Colonel Hogue's engineers collected every map available. Spread across a table, the charts looked like they were arguing with each other. Rivers appeared in different positions. Mountain ranges curved in opposite directions. And entire stretches were simply labeled unknown area, swamp, or the unsettling impassable in all seasons. At a briefing in Washington, an officer asked Hogue, "How do you intend to plan a route without reliable terrain data?" Hoag's reply was both blunt and strangely calm. "We will plan after we start, not before." It wasn't bravado. It was necessity. The United States did not have time for surveys. By the time a formal mapping operation was completed, the war could have shifted, the Aleutians could have fallen, and the Pacific Northwest might have been forced into an entirely new defensive posture. The solution was radical. Build the road first. Map the land in real time as the road advances. This decision reshaped the entire mission. To support the on-the-move mapping, the U.S. Army deployed 7 regiments of engineers, including the 35th, 341st, and the largely African-American 93rd and 95th Engineer Regiments. Their orders were brutally simple. Cut trees. Push forward. Find ground that doesn't fall apart under weight. Advance 10 to 20 kilometers per day, even if no one could confirm what lay ahead. Each regiment would carve its own sector through wilderness, hoping that all sections would meet correctly at predetermined junctions guessed from incomplete cartography. A misalignment of just a few degrees over long distance could miss the rendezvous point by dozens of kilometers. Officers reassured themselves with calm voices and sharp pencils. But the truth was less precise. The project's starting conditions contained a structural uncertainty that no blueprint could resolve. Some after-action reports noted an odd phenomenon. When radios crackled during planning sessions, there was a faint, cold flutter, as if signals were refracted strangely in the subarctic air. The engineers ignored it. The war offered no time for atmospheric mysteries. By mid-April, bulldozers, graders, supply trucks, and 11,000 men were ready. The command issued a simple line: "Advance north. Terrain will reveal itself." And then the engines started, one by one, creating a vibration that rolled across the frost like a low mechanical heartbeat. A heartbeat of a road not yet born. The first conflict wasn't the enemy, it was the ground itself. What looked solid from a distance often dissolved into muskeg the moment the first bulldozer touched it. To the engineers, the muskeg behaved like an organism with a slow, intelligent reaction time. Pressure would build. Nothing happened. And then, without warning, the earth liquefied, swallowing metal and machinery with a quiet, unsettling sigh. Operators began describing the ground using words usually reserved for animals. It shifts, it waits, it learns. These phrases weren't poetic. They were attempts to communicate a problem that defied normal engineering logic. To move forward, the regiments had to invent methods on the spot. One technique became infamous: laying down alternating layers of logs, called corduroy, to create a temporary roadbed where no roadbed should logically exist. Tens of thousands of trees were felled and aligned like ribs of a wooden skeleton, holding the terrain in place long enough for heavy equipment to pass. But even this had limits. Sometimes the corduroy floated upward as the muskeg pushed back, as if rejecting the very concept of a highway. Meanwhile, the weather behaved like a second adversary, not a backdrop, but an active participant. Temperatures swung from freezing to mud-producing warmth in single cycles, creating what the engineers called double-season days. The morning was winter. Noon was spring. Afternoon was winter again. Machinery cracked, mud expanded, and schedules disintegrated. Reports from the 341st noted a peculiar acoustic distortion on some mornings. Voices sounded slightly doubled, as if each person spoke with a faint echo that wasn't synchronized. One sergeant wrote, "The cold repeats you, but not correctly." Fatigue? Maybe. Atmospheric refraction? Possibly. But to the men, it became part of the landscape's personality, indifferent and slightly hostile. And then came the rivers. They were everywhere. Some shallow enough to walk across, others deep enough to hide armored vehicles. None were charted with confidence. Engineers waded into freezing currents with ropes tied to their waists, often unable to see more than a meter ahead. When the first pontoon bridge buckled under current pressure, the collapse sounded less like an accident and more like a warning. Timber snapped. Water hissed. A bulldozer slid sideways into the torrent, and the driver, still strapped in, recalled hearing a sharp metallic ping inside his headset before the machine submerged. He later insisted the sound was not internal. It was external, like something in the environment responding to the failure. But the worst conflict was pace. Higher command demanded progress of 10 to 20 kilometers per day, a number that felt almost absurd once reality set in. But logistics left no room for hesitation. The Aleutian threat was real, and Washington's urgency radiated downward like static. So the regiments pushed harder. Men slept in tents that froze solid at night, requiring them to punch their way out in the morning. Diesel turned to gel unless stored inside special heated shelters. Tools shattered like glass. And through all of it, the road had to grow, continuously, relentlessly. One corporal described the experience with a strange mechanical clarity. It felt like we were racing against something that didn't care we existed. Something cold. Something old. Another wrote simply, "We weren't building a road. We were invading the landscape. Forward. Always forward." By late May 1942, the race against the landscape had escalated from difficult to borderline surreal. The farther north the regiments advanced, the more the terrain behaved in ways that defied the expectations of even the most seasoned engineers. Satellite mapping did not exist. Aerial photography was inconsistent. And the ground truth, the physical reality under their boots, changed too quickly to predict. A daily ritual emerged. At dawn, men would awaken, step outside their tents, and discover that the world had rearranged itself. Snowfields had melted into lakes. Frozen rivers had fractured into drifting ice plates. And trails carved the previous day had vanished under fresh slides of mud and fallen timber. It was as if the environment were quietly undoing their work overnight, not maliciously, just indifferently. The 93rd Engineer Regiment encountered one of the strangest recurring challenges: trees that appeared to grow from unstable soil with almost no root system. Bulldozers pushed them aside with unusual ease, until operators realized why. The trunks were embedded in thin, floating mats of organic matter, vegetation rafts, suspended over waterlogged voids. One operator described driving across such terrain as driving over a wet drum and hearing the hollow echo follow your machine. Another added, "The ground felt like a stretched membrane. It flexed under us." Flexing ground was dangerous, but not the worst discovery. The worst came from the mountains. The northern interior held ranges that had never been properly measured. Engineers estimated elevations by eye, using rough triangulation and improvised instruments. But these estimates were often wrong, sometimes by hundreds of feet. During one ascent, a reconnaissance team reached what they believed was a ridgeline, only to discover it was merely a shelf with another ascent hidden behind it. The mistake added 3 days of climbing, carving, blasting, and bridging. Meanwhile, the weather continued its shape-shifting routine. Temperatures plunged so fast during one particular evening that lubricants inside several vehicles solidified mid-operation. Gears froze in place. Engines stalled mid-turn, as if the machines had been paused by an external command. A mechanic swore that one of the stalled engines emitted a faint harmonic tone. Not a whine, not a grind, something closer to a frequency pulse. He recorded it in his log. Sound resembled electrical interference. Source unknown. Fatigue does strange things to perception. But the acoustic anomalies kept appearing in the reports. The urgency coming from Washington grew sharper as Japanese forces consolidated their hold over Kiska and Attu. Rumors spread that more northern movement was expected. The engineers understood the implication. If Alaska fell, the highway would be too late. If they slowed down, the highway would be useless. So crews doubled shifts. Men worked 18-hour days. Equipment tore itself apart faster than mechanics could repair it. Fuel became a constant anxiety. Every additional kilometer north meant a longer supply chain, a longer vulnerability. Convoys had to travel roads that weren't finished, bridges that weren't tested, terrain that wasn't mapped. At one point, a fuel truck overturned in a ravine. The impact echoed strangely along the valley, as if the sound bounced back delayed, then replayed faintly, slightly distorted. Witnesses later wrote the echo didn't behave like sound. Most dismissed it as acoustics. A few wondered if the frozen air itself refracted the noise. But there was no time for speculation. The enemy wasn't behind them. The enemy wasn't ahead of them. The enemy was the clock. And the clock, like the landscape, wasn't cooperating. Forward. Faster. Before the North closed itself again. By early June 1942, the project reached a tipping point. Not because of enemy action, but because the system supporting the road began to fail faster than it could be repaired. The wilderness had absorbed weeks of relentless pressure, and now it pushed back with quiet, devastating consistency. The first major crisis came from supply lines. Fuel convoys began arriving late. Then, erratically. Then not at all. A single washed-out bridge could halt an entire regiment for hours. A destroyed section of corduroy could strand equipment so far from help that retrieval became a secondary project. The 35th Regiment calculated that for every kilometer they built, they were losing nearly half a kilometer to collapse, sinkage, or weather intrusion. The math was no longer encouraging. It was punishing. Worse, a subtle, unnerving pattern emerged. Radio messages between regiments experienced unexplained distortions, packets of static that did not match atmospheric conditions. Operators described the interference as layered, as if faint echoes of previous transmissions were bleeding into present conversations. One operator wrote, "The radio repeats us, out of sequence." Engineers blamed temperature inversions and magnetic anomalies near the mountains, but the distortion persisted. Meanwhile, exhaustion reshaped the men. 18-hour shifts blurred into one another. Meals were consumed standing up. Some soldiers reported moments in which the forest sounded too quiet, as though background noise had been filtered out. Others noted the opposite, that the air hummed faintly, like machinery running far away. These sensory inconsistencies led medical officers to recommend sleep cycles, but headquarters rejected the proposal. The order remained. Advance. Do not stop. Then came the mechanical failures. Bulldozers, which had become the backbone of the operation, began to show stress fractures along their frames. Steel, supposedly resilient even in cold temperatures, snapped in clean, unnatural lines. Mechanics stared at the brakes and said they looked machined, not fractured. One mechanic logged the following note. Metal behaved like brittle plastic. Failure pattern inconsistent with known stress behavior. The report was filed and ignored. Meanwhile, in the Yukon sector, a key bridge collapsed under what should have been an acceptable load. The collapse was strange, not a violent break, but a slow, synchronized sag, as if the bridge exhaled and gave up. A corporal nearby later described hearing a faint pulse immediately before the failure. Not a sound, he said. A pressure. Like the air blinked. But crisis does not require mystery to grow. It grows naturally from numbers. Too many kilometers unfinished. Too many vehicles disabled. Too many men stretched thin. Too many variables unmeasured. The Japanese occupation of Kiska and Attu intensified pressure from Washington. Rumors of a possible northern push circulated daily. The War Department demanded progress reports that became increasingly difficult to produce honestly. And yet, despite the chaos, something remarkable occurred. Even as the terrain consumed their work, even as machinery faltered, even as men began speaking in tired monotones that sounded half human, half mechanical, the road continued to grow. Not steadily, not smoothly, but undeniably. A chaotic forward motion, jagged, improvised, desperately engineered, pushing deeper into the unmapped cold. The crisis had arrived, yes. But so had something else. Momentum. By mid-June, the road crews entered what later reports would call the fracture zone, a stretch of land where the terrain's behavior shifted from difficult to outright unstable. Here, the ground was not simply soft or wet. It behaved unpredictably, as if it operated on its own internal schedule. The first major incident occurred near the Liard River sector. A bulldozer weighing nearly 20 tons advanced over what looked like stable soil. The operator reported a mild vibration, not unusual, followed by a sudden sensation that the machine was floating. He increased throttle. The dozer sank instantly. Not gradually. Not realistically. Instantly. The ground opened beneath it like a silent, mechanical aperture, swallowing the vehicle to the engine block before anyone could react. Rescue crews arrived within minutes, but by then the machine was already tilting, slipping deeper. One man tried anchoring a tow cable to a nearby spruce, only to watch the tree uproot itself with frightening ease, as though the soil had lost all structural intention. The operator survived, pulled out moments before the dozer disappeared under a layer of cold, brown slurry. When engineers probed the site, they discovered an underground cavity, a collapsed pocket of muskeg layered over a hidden pool of meltwater. In theory, these cavities existed everywhere. In practice, this one felt wrong. The cavity's edges were smooth, unnaturally regular. A sergeant described the walls as shaped, not eroded. His report ended with an odd sentence. Acoustic test returned a dampened echo. Something absorbed sound. This was dismissed as exhaustion. But then, a second failure struck. A half-completed timber bridge over a narrow gorge began to emit a series of rhythmic creaks, almost patterned, almost intentional. Witnesses said the sounds resembled a mechanical sequence, like a machine cycling through gears. Before anyone could secure the structure, the support beams sheared off cleanly, sending the central span collapsing into the gorge below. The collapse did not roar. It whispered. The debris struck the bottom without producing a proper echo. It was as if the sound stopped mid-air. Meanwhile, the regiments further west encountered a different structural nightmare: permafrost melt. Entire hillsides transformed into moving slurry, not landslides, but creeping flows that advanced meter by meter, hour by hour, pushing trees aside like brittle matchsticks. Engineers stood helpless as these flows erased whole sections of road faster than they could rebuild them. One lieutenant wrote, "It felt like the land was thinking about moving, and then decided to do it." Sleep deprivation blurred judgment. Men began referring to terrain features as if they had personalities. Ridges waited. Valleys held their breath. The cold listened. To make matters worse, the strange radio distortions grew more frequent. Operators reported receiving fragments of messages that had never been sent, ghost transmissions with no clear source, repeating old coordinates or clipped instructions out of order. A recorded log captured one such anomaly. A dance north, terrain will, sound returns. The transmission broke into static before any pattern could be analyzed. Again, the anomalies were attributed to atmospheric interference. Again, the engineers pushed forward. But the failures continued. Road sections cracked without pressure. Snowfields collapsed into sinkholes. Even the air felt heavier, as if thickened by cold humidity and the weight of the work itself. Progress slowed to a crawl. Yet orders from Washington remained absolute. The road must connect, no matter the cost. And so the men advanced into terrain that was no longer merely difficult, but unstable on a fundamental level. A place where ground, air, and sound behaved as if governed by rules not yet understood. A place that did not want a road. As July 1942 approached, the project transitioned into its most delicate phase. The convergence, the moment when the separately constructed segments of the Alcan Highway were supposed to meet in predetermined locations. In theory, this was simple engineering. In practice, it became a crisis. For major construction fronts were advancing toward each other across hundreds of kilometers of unmapped wilderness. Their coordinates were based on maps that barely agreed on the shapes of the rivers, let alone the true distances between key valleys. And now, as the regiments pushed deeper into the frontier, their compasses began to disagree. Not wildly, not dramatically, just enough to matter. A subtle, persistent drift. Survey teams tried compensating. They recalibrated instruments. They repeated measurements. They checked theodolites against the stars. But the stars offered little comfort. Cloud cover swallowed the sky on most nights, and when the aurora flared green and white, the light distorted shadows enough to confuse even experienced observers. By late June, the 35th and 340th Regiments realized their projected meeting point had shifted by nearly 3 kilometers, a result that should have been impossible given their calculations. One surveyor wrote, "It's as if the land itself changed shape while we were building." A second recorded an even stranger note. Echo patterns no longer match topography. Sound returns from angles that do not correspond to terrain. These reports were reviewed, stamped, and archived without comment. Meanwhile, the radio anomalies intensified. Messages between regiments sometimes arrived with faint overlays of old transmissions, like ghost voices whispering outdated coordinates underneath the current ones. One operator described it as time-stacked static, as though the airwaves were holding on to memory. A captured fragment from the logs read, "Ridge not where, advance adjust, mapping inconsistent." None of these fragments could be traced to any active transmitter. Still, the men pressed on. The convergence crisis escalated sharply during a joint reconnaissance between the 93rd and 340th. Both regiments believed they were within less than a kilometer of each other. Yet the signals exchanged by torchlight were never seen. The sound of distant engines never aligned. Even flares disappeared into mist as if swallowed. It took 2 additional days of searching to realize that a valley, previously thought to run straight, actually curved westward in a sweeping arc that no map had ever suggested. The engineers began to question their instruments, their maps, and occasionally their own senses. A lieutenant described walking along a ridge and hearing his footsteps echo ahead of him, not behind. Another reported that his compass needle shivered whenever he faced north. Not moved, not deviated, but trembled with a faint metallic jitter. The physical world was beginning to feel unreliable. Logistics suffered. Fuel deliveries missed their checkpoints. Bridge timbers arrived at the wrong sector. Survey markers placed carefully were sometimes found tilted or displaced the next morning, attributed to frost heave, wind, or animals, though none of those explanations fully matched the movement patterns. And yet, despite the mounting chaos, the project could not pause. Orders from headquarters were clear. Convergence must be achieved. The road must connect before winter. Winter, the silent deadline approaching faster than anyone wanted to admit. The men understood the stakes. They also understood a terrifying new truth. Even if every soldier worked at full speed, even if every machine survived the cold, even if the rivers cooperated and the ground held, it would all mean nothing if the segments failed to align. Because a road that doesn't meet is not a road at all. It is a collection of dead ends. And for the first time, some engineers began to fear that the land itself might make that outcome inevitable. By early July, the engineers were no longer battling just the terrain, they were battling themselves. Fatigue had become a structural component of the project. Men who once spoke with confidence now moved slowly, mechanically, as if their bodies were performing tasks independently of their thoughts. Medical officers noted changes in behavior. Speech slowed. Reaction times elongated. Some soldiers paused mid-sentence, as though waiting for their own words to buffer before continuing. A pattern emerged. The longer a unit worked in the deep interior, the more its members reported sensory distortions. Nothing dramatic. Just small fractures in normal perception. Sounds arriving out of order. Footsteps seeming too loud or too soft. Voices gaining a faint harmonic undertone, not metallic, but not entirely organic either. One officer described it this way. It felt like the world was slightly misaligned with itself. The stress of the convergence crisis amplified these effects. Regiments that were supposed to meet in specific valleys found themselves drifting off course, recalculating again, and still arriving in terrain that looked subtly different from what their earlier scouting had described. A reconnaissance sergeant wrote in his notebook, "Trees don't match previous sketches. Either we're wrong, or the forest changed." Another wrote something more unsettling. "I heard my partner call my name from behind me. When I turned, he wasn't there. He was ahead of me. He hadn't spoken. Exhaustion remained the official explanation. But exhaustion couldn't explain the instruments. Theodolites began giving inconsistent readings. Levels would show perfect horizontality, only for builders to discover the resulting structure visibly leaned. Compasses flickered at random intervals, the needles vibrating as if reacting to a distant signal. Mechanics saw it too. Engines developed rhythmic fluctuations in idle speed, micro-oscillations that produced patterns resembling Morse code, though none matched known signatures. Fuel pumps throbbed irregularly. One generator emitted a soft oscillation at night, barely audible but unmistakably patterned. A technician recorded it on paper. ... repeating every 17 seconds. No one deciphered it. The environment contributed to the breakdown. Night noises became unpredictable. Sometimes the forest went totally silent, an unnatural stillness that made men hold their breath without meaning to. Other times, the trees creaked in chorus, synchronized like a slow mechanical hinge turning across kilometers. One soldier claimed he heard the ground groan, a long, low vibration, not loud but deeply physical. His report ended with, "Not sure if external or internal." Psychological strain grew. Fights broke out among crews that had worked peacefully for months. Men accused each other of misplacing gear, redrawing maps, shifting survey markers. But the truth was simpler and more frightening. No one trusted their senses anymore. And then came the night of the double ghost signal. 2 regiments, separated by more than 40 kilometers, reported receiving the same transmission at the same time, a faint, delayed whisper over the radio. "Advance north. Terrain will reveal itself." It was the same line Colonel Hogue had spoken months earlier. But the transmission source could not be identified. No nearby units had broadcast anything. The signal strength was inconsistent with local radios. Headquarters dismissed it as atmospheric reflection, though radio operators insisted atmospheric reflection did not create new transmissions. Whether it was an echo of the past, a glitch, or something else, the message was interpreted as an order. Men pushed deeper into the interior that night, long after protocol said to sleep. Fatigue, the landscape, and the war had fused into one challenge, indistinguishable, indivisible. A human system failure. Not loud, not catastrophic, but cumulative, creeping, inevitable. By mid-July, the engineers weren't just tired, they were drifting. Not physically, but cognitively, as if their internal maps were diverging from the real world. It started with small errors. A man would misremember where he'd placed a tool. A surveyor would insist a ridge had been higher the day before. A driver would swear a bend in the road had shifted, even though the markers were still in place. At first, these mistakes were dismissed as stress. But the mistakes accumulated, too many, too consistent, too aligned in theme. The 340th Regiment reported that men were misidentifying directions. North felt wrong. West felt closer. A compass could insist on magnetic truth, yet a soldier's intuition resisted it, like 2 overlapping systems disagreeing quietly but firmly. One lieutenant described it in his log. The brain wants the terrain to be shaped a certain way. The terrain disagrees. Even written records became unstable. Journals showed inconsistencies between entries written only hours apart. Field notes contradicted earlier sketches. Some men returned to places they had mapped days before only to find the topography subtly altered, not dramatically, but enough to break confidence. A sergeant wrote, "Everything here looks like itself, but slightly mis-copied." Meanwhile, radio anomalies sharpened. Operators began hearing faint repetitions of their own transmissions, not echoes, but near-perfect replicas delayed by minutes or hours. One operator recorded the following sequence. 341st to 35th, surveying complete. Static. 341st to 35th, surveying complete. Static. 341st to 35th, leet, leet, leet. The third version sounded corrupted, like a degraded recording processed through an unfamiliar filter. Yet no recording equipment was being used. In the Yukon sector, auditory drift appeared. Men reported hearing footsteps behind them, only to find no one there. Some heard their names spoken softly, but indistinctly, as though the speaker were far away or underwater. The medical officers blamed a combination of hypothermia, sleep loss, and sensory overload. But not all symptoms matched known patterns. Some soldiers experienced moments where their depth perception shifted, objects seemed farther than they were, or too close. One bulldozer operator described the world flattening, turning three-dimensional space into something that looked printed. Then, more troubling, time drift. Crew leaders noticed men losing track of minutes. Shifts that should have lasted 3 hours felt like one. Brief conversations were forgotten seconds later. A few reported déjà vu so strong they believed entire sequences of events were repeating. A private wrote, "I walked the same 12 steps twice. I am certain. The second time, the snow already had my footprints." The environment contributed to the drift. Echoes no longer behaved like real echoes. Voices bounced back in strange rhythms, sometimes too fast, sometimes too delayed, sometimes with slight tonal distortion. During a night shift, a group reported hearing a distant mechanical hum, steady and smooth, like a generator operating underground. But no such machine existed anywhere near their position. The hum stopped instantly when they approached the sound's direction. Meanwhile, the convergence crisis intensified the cognitive drift. Regiments trying to meet found their mental maps diverging so sharply that teams disagreed about which direction they had come from. A chilling moment occurred when two survey teams, supposedly only 1.2 kilometers apart, claimed to be on higher ground than the other. Both insisted the valley sloped downward away from their position. This was mathematically impossible. And yet both teams stood by their observations. Fatigue, optical illusion, atmospheric refractive anomalies. Maybe, but the pattern persisted. The commanders knew something alarming. If the men could no longer trust their instruments, and could no longer trust their own perception, the road itself might cease to exist as a coherent project. Because perception, not steel, not timber, not engines, is the first tool of engineering. And on the frontier, that tool was failing. Late July brought the first true catastrophe, not a setback, not a delay, but a structural failure large enough to threaten the entire project. It happened in the southeastern sector, where the 35th Regiment had been fighting to keep a precarious section of road stable across a shallow valley. The ground there was a mosaic of frozen layers, melt channels, and pockets of muskeg that behaved like a breathing organism. For days, the engineers sensed something was off. The soil vibrated faintly at night. Not from machinery, from within. A slow, rhythmic tremor that felt almost like a pulse. Survey rods, when driven into the earth, trembled slightly before settling. Compasses jittered. Even footsteps sounded heavier, as though the ground resisted impact. But no one expected a full collapse. At 9:42 hours, the valley floor dropped. Not gradually. Not in sections. It sank as a single continuous sheet, a downward flex of earth that looked impossibly synchronized, like a giant exhaling. The collapse swallowed 180 meters of road, 3 bulldozers, 1 bridge abutment, and an entire line of timber supports. Men dove for safety as the ground buckled beneath them. The earth didn't split, it folded, a motion more fluid than geological behavior should allow. Witnesses described the sound differently. Some said it boomed. Others said it whispered. One corporal recorded. It sounded like a low-frequency tone, like a single sustained note. A mechanic added, "Not a crack, a hum." Moments after the collapse, the valley fell silent, unnervingly so. No wind, no bird calls, no water movement. Just silence. Then the radio interference began. Operators attempting to report the collapse heard their own voices return fragmented and time shifted. Valley, collapse, send. Static. Collapse, send, valley. Static. Val, lay, call, apps. One operator swore the last fragment contained his own voice, from a message he had not yet transmitted. Meanwhile, engineers scrambled to assess the damage. The valley floor had lowered by nearly 2 meters, creating a bowl-shaped depression where a stable roadbed should have been. Corduroy logs that had been firmly anchored were now suspended mid-air, perfectly horizontal, no longer touching the ground, a visual impossibility the men struggled to process. One lieutenant knelt beside the suspended logs and wrote, "Ground loss inconsistent with known subsidence patterns. Appears selective." As reconstruction efforts began, new anomalies emerged. Laser levels, recently issued experimental devices, produced readings that oscillated unpredictably. Manual leveling tools disagreed with each other. A measuring tape laid across the depression measured 182 meters. Laid again minutes later, 184. A third time, 181. No one could explain it. The psychological impact deepened. Some men refused to walk near the collapse zone. Others stared at it for long periods, claiming the depression moved slightly when they looked away. One private swore the bowl-shaped valley tightened, as though its edges leaned inward. Fatigue and stress were blamed, but fatigue did not explain the way sound behaved around the depression. Voices spoke normally on approach, but when men stepped within 20 meters of the collapsed area, their words grew muted, as if absorbed by the air. An engineer testing acoustic response clapped his hands at various distances. At the center of the depression, the clap produced no echo. None. He repeated the test. Again, no echo. His report ended simply. Area behaves acoustically dead. Commanders issued new directives. Stabilize the valley. Restore the road. Deny the collapse any chance to slow the convergence. But this was no ordinary collapse. This was a structural event that defied prediction, the kind of failure that rewrites both schedules and assumptions. Worse, it reinforced a growing, unspoken fear among the men. The land was not merely resisting. It was reacting. After the valley collapse, the engineers expected more ground failures. What they did not expect was for the interference to spread beyond the terrain, into every operational system supporting the road. The first sign came from the navigation teams. Maps, compasses, and bearings had always carried a margin of uncertainty. But now the discrepancies grew impossible to ignore. A route drawn in the morning no longer matched the shape of the land in the afternoon. Valleys curved in unfamiliar arcs. Tree lines shifted ever so slightly. Distances recorded one day expanded or contracted the next. A senior surveyor wrote, "Either the land is moving, or our tools are drifting. Neither option is acceptable." Then the communications network began to unravel. Radio operators reported layered distortions. Messages echoing themselves, echoes overlaying each other, fragments repeating in loops that did not match any known interference pattern. One operator captured a sequence that was later analyzed and dismissed as equipment malfunction, though the operator insisted otherwise. 35th to 93rd, supply delayed. Static. Supply delayed, 35th to 93rd. Static. 35th to 35th. Tch. Burst of digital light clipping, decades before digital equipment existed. The final fragment sounded almost synthetic. Meanwhile, mechanical interference surfaced in the regiment's vehicles. Engines sputtered without fuel starvation. Gears slipped without wear. Suspension systems creaked in consistent, unnatural rhythms, like coded ticks. One mechanic described a bulldozer that idled in a perfect pattern, like a repeating phrase. He recorded 8 seconds of engine pulses in his logbook. Short long slash short long slash short long. The pattern repeated for nearly a full minute before returning to normal. Some men joked that the machines were talking. Others didn't laugh. The environmental sensors brought their own problems. Thermometers showed sudden fluctuations, drops of 8 to 10 degrees in seconds, followed by rapid stabilization. Barometric readings swung unpredictably. A portable anemometer recorded wind direction shifting in a perfect 360-degree rotation, as though the air circled itself. When a senior meteorologist reviewed the logs, he made an unsettling note. These readings do not reflect atmospheric behavior. They reflect something interfering with measurement. He could not specify what something meant. Meanwhile, the terrain sensed opportunity. Muskeg fields grew unstable again, swallowing 2 more vehicles. Rivers surged without rainfall. Hillsides groaned loudly at night, the sounds echoing strangely, as if the echoes originated from a different angle than the original noise. One night, a sentry reported hearing footsteps approaching camp. He challenged the figure. No response. The footsteps continued. When he shone his light, the sound stopped, but no footprints were visible in the mud. He filed a report that ended with, "Sound source uncertain." Command tried to impose order. They ordered more frequent bearings, more detailed logs, double checks of all measurements, mandatory rest periods, though men rarely slept. But as the interference spread, the largest threat emerged. The sectors advanced toward convergence. But no 2 regiments agreed on where the convergence point actually was. Coordinates drifted. Maps contradicted themselves. A straight line on paper bent inexplicably when measured on the ground. One commander described the phenomenon with brutal simplicity. "It's like we're trying to connect a road across a landscape that doesn't want to stay still." And underneath it all, morale began to fracture. Men whispered about the land watching them. Machines behaving with intention. Radios repeating orders no one gave. Footsteps with no walkers. Measurements that refused to stay fixed. Stress explains much, but not everything. The systemic interference was no longer a series of isolated anomalies. It had become a pattern, complex, pervasive, and accelerating. And the road, already fragile, now depended on systems that were no longer reliable. By late July, a quiet consensus spread through the regiments. They had crossed into something, a threshold, a boundary, an invisible horizon. Beyond it, the rules of the project no longer behaved as expected. No one used the term event horizon. That would come later, in private journals and letters home. But the feeling was unmistakable. The first sign emerged in the convergence corridors. 4 days, the 93rd and 340th Regiments advanced along valleys that should have brought them toward each other. Their compasses aligned. Their bearings matched. Their maps, flawed but functional, indicated a clear trajectory of approach. And yet the distance between them refused to shrink. At 0700 hours, estimated separation, 4.8 kilometers. At 1400 hours, estimated separation, 5.1 kilometers. At 1830 hours, estimated separation, 4.9 kilometers. They had advanced continuously. One surveyor wrote, "It's like we are moving forward and staying still at the same time." Meanwhile, unusual distortions began appearing in the soundscape. Voices carried too far one moment, then vanished entirely the next. A hammer strike echoed with perfect clarity, then failed to echo at all. Some echoes returned slightly delayed, with a faint tonal mismatch, as if the returned sound came from another environment. A corporal described it as hearing your own voice come back wrong. Then the visual anomalies began. Nothing supernatural, just not consistent. Shadows stretched in directions that did not correspond to the sun. Tree lines appeared sharper one moment, blurred the next, as though the atmosphere intermittently lost resolution. Haze drifted in geometric patterns, straight lines instead of organic curves. A bulldozer operator described a moment where the world jumped, a brief flicker, like a single missing frame in a film reel. He blinked and everything was normal. But he insisted he had lost half a second of reality. Exhaustion explained much. But exhaustion alone could not explain the navigation distortions. The 35th Regiment reported encountering the same clearing twice. Identical tree patterns, identical rock formations, identical soil depressions. They marked the clearing the first time. When they encountered it again an hour later, the marker was still there, in the same place, with the same orientation, untouched. Their report described the event as locational loop, path consistency uncertain. Commanders labeled it a mapping error. But privately, they rechecked their bearings 3 times and found no mistakes. Then came the most unsettling incident of the phase. During a pre-dawn shift, 3 men reported seeing a faint column of light in the distance. Not a flare, not headlights, not lightning. The light was vertical, pale, and steady, like an illuminated pillar rising through fog. It vanished after 10 seconds. When they reached the location, nothing remained except a patch of ground that felt unusually warm, as if it had been exposed to sunlight, even though the sun had not yet risen. Their instruments recorded no anomaly, but their log included a peculiar phrase: air density irregular. Around the same time, radio interference reached a new level. Operators began receiving fragments of messages that seemed anticipatory, transmissions that referenced coordinates not yet reached, or events that had not yet occurred. One captured sequence chilled the crew. Bridge failure imminent, adjust vector, North Ridge compromised. Hours later, a bridge did fail in the northern sector. Coincidence? Atmospheric distortions? Misinterpretation? Officially, yes. Unofficially, the operators refused to use the radios alone after dark. By now, the convergence crisis had escalated into something more existential. Not a failure of planning, but a breakdown of alignment between map, land, and perception. One officer summarized it with unsettling clarity. We are navigating through a place that is not staying where we put it. And yet the road continued forward. Its segments dragged themselves closer, even as the landscape twisted around them. Even as the instruments faltered. Even as the men sensed they had crossed a threshold into a region where certainty itself dissolved. The event horizon had been crossed, and none of them understood what lay on the other side. By early August, the distortions no longer confined themselves to individual incidents or isolated sectors. They expanded outward, affecting entire stretches of the route. The engineers began referring to these regions informally as deep fields, areas where distance, sound, and even time felt unstable. The first major anomaly occurred in a wide basin between 2 unnamed ridges. A survey team crossed the basin in 47 minutes. Their return trip along the same path took nearly 2 hours, with no changes in terrain, no slope, no weather shift, and no mechanical failures. Their pedometers recorded nearly identical step counts. Their watches disagreed. One watch gained 6 minutes. Another lost 4. A third froze for nearly 20 seconds, then resumed as if nothing had happened. The incident was documented as temporal inconsistency with spatial stability. Command dismissed it as instrument malfunction. But the men noticed something else. On their return journey, the basin felt longer. Not physically, perceptually. A subtle stretch, like a fabric pulled tight. Then came the horizon distortion. In the western sector, the 35th Regiment reported that a distant tree line appeared to bend slightly to the left, as if the Earth's curvature shifted irregularly in that direction. The distortion vanished when approached, only to reappear from a distance at a different angle. Binoculars revealed nothing unusual. Naked eyes reported the bend clearly. A private wrote, "Objects at the edge of vision behave like they're not anchored." Meanwhile, sound continued its unpredictable evolution. The forest developed what the engineers called soft zones, areas where sound was muted, dulled, or absorbed. Footsteps became quiet. Voices lost clarity. Tools struck wood with no echo. One such soft zone expanded over 3 days, growing from a 20-meter patch to nearly 200 meters. Inside it, even heavy machinery sounded distant, like hearing an engine through several layers of insulation. But the opposite also occurred. Hard zones formed, pockets where sound amplified unnaturally. A cough could carry hundreds of meters. A snapped twig sounded like gunfire. Clanking metal reverberated in strange harmonic patterns. One sergeant described a moment when the wind seemed to bring two versions of a sound, one faint, one delayed, one slightly higher in pitch. He wrote, "It's like sound has started forking." Then the visual duplication event happened. Two bulldozer operators working at dawn reported seeing a second silhouette of their own machine projected faintly onto the fog. Not a shadow, not a reflection, but a pale, semi-transparent outline moving a fraction of a second behind the real machine. When the fog lifted, the duplication vanished. The operators never spoke of it again. At the same time, the magnetic field behaved unpredictably. Compasses swung in wide arcs, then stabilized suddenly, then twitched as if answering unseen stimuli. Survey poles placed in the ground vibrated gently without wind. A level placed on a wooden plank rolled its bubbles slowly from left to right, as though following a gradient not present in the physical ground. One technician reported that his compass needle briefly split into two faint afterimages, both pointing in slightly different directions. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the compass was normal. But his hands were shaking. The most dramatic distortion manifested in the 93rd Regiment's supply convoy. A 5-truck convoy left at 5:30. At 6:50, it had still not arrived at the next checkpoint. Search teams fanned out along the supply route. At 7:12, the convoy reappeared, driving calmly out of a fog bank that had not existed moments earlier. The drivers insisted they had been driving continuously, without stopping, without delay. Their dashboard clocks were all behind by different amounts. 3 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, 12. One truck had a clock that gained 17 minutes. Command ruled it a navigational error. The men knew better. The distortions were no longer challenges. They were environmental conditions. And the road, forced through the shifting landscape, became a tense line stretched across something that did not want to stay fixed. The engineers continued to advance. Not because they understood the distortions, but because turning back would be harder. And because Washington insisted the convergence must happen, even if the world between the regiments refused to hold still. By mid-August, the project reached a point where the land no longer behaved like land. Not fully. Not reliably. Not in a way that allowed planning to function. Every regiment felt it, a collective awareness that they were building a road across a landscape drifting toward instability, like pressure accumulating under ice before a break. The first major sign came from the mountain passes. A reconnaissance team from the 341st Regiment climbed a ridge that should have offered a clear view of the valley below. Instead, they found the horizon shimmering, not with heat, but with a faint ripple, as though the air itself was bending the world behind it. The ripple lasted 3 seconds. Then the view snapped back into focus. One man thought he saw a second ridge behind the first, perfectly overlapping and then fading, like a double exposure. He rubbed his eyes. The world returned to normal. But normal wasn't holding. In the northern sector, a segment of corduroy logs drifted sideways overnight, not by rolling or sliding, but by appearing shifted approximately 40 centimeters to the east. There were no drag marks. No disturbed soil. It was as if the logs had been lifted, moved, and placed again. A mechanic wrote, "Logs displaced with precision. Not natural." Then the frost line began to misbehave. Permafrost thawed in geometric patterns, rectangular grids as clean as survey plots. You could walk across a section of rigid frozen dirt and then suddenly step onto soft, thawed soil shaped in a perfect square. Engineers inspected the phenomenon and found no cause, no sun exposure difference, no drainage inconsistency, no chemical contamination. One lieutenant said, "It looks like the ground has been edited." Meanwhile, time drift intensified. Teams reported losing synchronization even when working side by side. Watches worn by men only meters apart began to differ by minutes, then more. 2 men standing in the same spot recorded different durations for the same task. One wrote 3 minutes. Another wrote 9. A third, 6. All swore they were correct. But the most disturbing instability came from the terrain memory. or the lack of it. Survey markers placed at dusk were found at dawn angled differently, as if the ground had subtly rotated beneath them. In one case, a marker had shifted nearly 12 degrees. In another, a series of stakes formed a perfect arc where the night before they had been straight. A senior surveyor tested the phenomenon by placing a line of stakes himself, then watching them directly for 30 minutes. Nothing happened. He blinked once. When he looked again, the middle stake leaned slightly to the left. He didn't report it officially. He simply wrote, "Momentary discontinuity. Observing becomes unreliable." The auditory world also fractured. Soft zones and hard zones multiplied, merging into what the engineers called acoustic corridors. In these corridors, sound traveled in narrow, controlled paths. A man could whisper and be heard perfectly 200 meters away, but someone standing 10 meters to the side would hear nothing at all. It created surreal moments during work shifts. Orders issued loudly vanished in silence. Clinks of metal echoed strangely from places where no walls or slopes existed. Some sounds repeated themselves, as though trapped and released later. One night, a group heard a hammer strike ring out twice, the second strike occurring several seconds after the first, even though only one blow had been delivered. Radio interference escalated too. Now transmissions arrived in reverse order, the end of a sentence arriving first, then the beginning. Others arrived scrambled, but not randomly. Certain words repeated, others fractured into syllables. A recorded fragment. North advance, revise. The line, the line, the line. All attempts to decode the patterns failed. Then the landscape produced its most alarming instability yet. At 2:17, the 340th Regiment reported seeing a distant ridgeline shiver. Not move. Not collapse. Shiver, a rapid oscillation, like a vibrating wire. The oscillation lasted less than a second. The ridge stood unchanged afterward. But nearly every witness described the same effect. The world flickered. A frame missing. A slight jump. A half instant where the landscape didn't update. One man described it as reality stalled. The threshold had been reached. Not crossed, not yet, but fully visible. A line where the world still held together by familiarity, and beyond which something else waited. A road cannot be built on unstable ground. But the engineers were no longer certain the ground was the problem. Something deeper was changing. By late August, the highway's advance had narrowed to its final challenge. The segments that had wandered, drifted, twisted, and reinterpreted the landscape now stood less than 10 kilometers apart. Almost close enough to see each other's dust. Close enough to hear each other's engines. Close enough that, under normal circumstances, the convergence would have been guaranteed. But these weren't normal circumstances. The closer the segments came, the more violently the environment rebelled. It began with terrain stutter. Engineers from the 93rd Regiment documented sections of ground that appeared stable, then suddenly shifted several centimeters sideways, not sliding, but snapping into a new alignment like a page turning. The logs read, "Topsoil displacement, instantaneous. Orientation shift, unpatterned." Men described the sensation of standing on ground that moved faster than the body could register. A corporal wrote, "It felt like the world took one step to the left." Then came the convergence mirage. At dusk, surveyors spotted what appeared to be the lights of the opposing regiment, faint glows through the treeline, spaced perfectly in a linear row. But as they approached, the lights retreated. Then duplicated. Then vanished. The men reached the clearing only to find untouched forest, no lights, no equipment, nothing but an unnatural stillness. 2 hours later, the actual opposing regiment reported seeing lights in the opposite direction, equally unreachable. Mirages? Refractions? Atmospheric lensing? All possible. But not the next phenomenon. Directional inversion. 3 men walking north felt the wind on their faces. They turned south, and the wind remained on their faces, blowing the same way. They checked flags, grass movement, smoke trails. The wind was blowing in two opposite directions at once. One man tried to dismiss it. Another trembled. The third quietly refused to walk alone for the rest of the night. Meanwhile, time drift reached a breaking point. Crew leaders found that synchronized watches no longer matched even within the same work group. Time checks were performed every hour. Watches diverged regardless of initial alignment. One watch recorded 37 minutes in the span of an hour. Another recorded 98. A third counted exactly 60, but its second hand paused every 7 ticks, a glitch with no mechanical cause. Men joked nervously that time had terrain issues, too. But none joked about the convergence field. At the heart of the pre-convergence zone, the land behaved as if caught between two competing states. Shadows bent against the sun. Sound traveled in irregular pulses. Ridges shifted slightly between viewpoints. A straight line drawn in the morning curved by afternoon. And within this field, machinery malfunctioned in unpredictable ways. Engines accelerated without throttle input. Headlights flickered in patterns resembling coded transmission. Two trucks stalled simultaneously, despite no mechanical link between them. When mechanics inspected the engines, all pistons stopped at the exact same rotation angle, a statistically impossible outcome. Their report concluded. Failure synchronized. Unknown cause. But the most disturbing event came from a reconnaissance pair assigned to mark the convergence point. They approached a narrow pass between two hills, the smallest distance yet between the segments. As they reached the pass, they felt the air pressure shift. Not drop. Not rise. Shift, like stepping from one sealed room into another. The world ahead looked normal. Trees. Brush. A faint glow from the opposing regiment's campfire beyond the ridge. Then the glow blinked. Vanished. Reappeared 30 meters to the right. Then 30 meters to the left. Then in a place where no camp could physically exist. The two men retreated. When they returned with reinforcements, the glow was gone entirely. Their joint report carried one line that circulated through the regiments like a whispered warning. The land is not allowing alignment. Even Colonel Hogue felt it now, a pressure, a static tension in the air, as if the entire frontier were holding its breath. The segments were within reach of each other, but the world between them was unraveling. A convergence was imminent, but so was something else. On the last day of August 1942, under a thin gray sky that refused to brighten, the two advancing segments of the Alcan Highway closed to within 3 kilometers of each other. The final stretch should have been the simplest. It became the most surreal. At 5:10, the 341st Regiment received a visual confirmation. A faint plume of dust rising beyond the ridge to the north, the unmistakable signature of heavy vehicles. They were close. Closer than ever. Voices crackled over radio. Maintain heading. Maintain heading. But the signal arrived fragmented, sliced into staggered intervals. Words overlapped themselves. Maintain, heading, heading. Operators stared at their equipment, unsure whether to respond. The land felt tense, as if the terrain itself anticipated what would happen next. The 93rd Regiment, advancing from the opposite direction, reported hearing distant engines. Then the sound doubled. Then tripled. Then arrived out of sequence, echoing like overlapping timelines. A corporal said, "I heard them coming before they were coming." Still, both regiments pressed forward. The convergence corridor narrowed to less than a kilometer. Surveyors prepared final bearings. Engineers primed bulldozers for the last push. But when they attempted to set the final alignment markers, the ground refused to agree. Stake A and Stake B were placed 200 meters apart. Measured distance, 200 meters. Measured again, 193. Again, 207. Again, 200. The markers did not move. The world moved around them. Yet the commanders ordered the advance to continue. At 6:52, the two regiments came within visual range. For a moment, a single, perfect moment, everything aligned. The trees parted. The ridgelines matched. The air stilled. And across a narrow valley, they saw each other. Men, machines, vehicles, tents, all framed by the cold northern light. Cheers erupted. Shouts echoed. Some waved their helmets. Others ran forward, tripping over brush in excitement. It was working. The impossible had happened. Then the world glitched. The first sign was the dust plume. It froze midair for half a second, like a frame locked on film. Then it resumed. Next, the opposing regiment flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. Not disappearing, but shifting position by half a meter each flicker, as though the image of the men lagged behind their actual movement. A sergeant shouted, "Hold! Hold!" His voice broke into 2 separate echoes, one delayed, one accelerated, before collapsing into static. Then the valley itself began to ripple. A low-frequency vibration rolled across the ground. Not an earthquake, a wave, moving too smoothly, too consistently, like the land was adjusting itself. Trees bowed. Corduroy logs clicked against each other in a synchronized rhythm. Compasses twitched violently. Men stumbled as their depth perception warped. The valley seemed to lengthen and compress in alternating pulses. Still, the regiments advanced. They were within 300 meters of each other. Then 200. Then 150. The air pressure shifted, a sudden drop followed by a heavy, suffocating weight. Men clutched their ears. Some fell to their knees. Radios erupted with a burst of layered transmissions. Convergence incomplete. Adjust, adjust. North is not stable. Terrain will. Static. Do not align. Then silence. Dead, absolute silence. At 110 meters distance, the most unexplainable phenomenon occurred. The 2 regiments saw each other. And then they saw each other again, slightly offset, as if reality duplicated the opposing force for a fraction of a second. 2 versions. One stable. One delayed. The delayed version dissolved like mist. The stable one persisted. The engineers didn't know whether to move forward or freeze. Then, as abruptly as the distortions began, the world snapped back into coherence. A single crack echoed across the valley. A clean, sharp sound like ice breaking. And the 2 roads met. Bulldozers from the 341st touched earth carved by the 93rd. Chains rattled. Men shouted. Someone burst into tears. The convergence was complete. But no one forgot what happened in the seconds before. A road had been built across thousands of kilometers of unmapped wilderness. Yet in its final meters, it encountered something that maps could never describe. A threshold. A distortion. A resistance. Something that reacted to alignment. The men did not celebrate loudly. They simply stood there, exhausted, staring at the point where 2 realities briefly overlapped. The road was connected. But the world had not wanted it to be. In the days following the convergence, the frontier grew unnaturally quiet. No more flickering ridgelines. No drifting shadows. No duplicated silhouettes or stuttering horizons. The distortions, for reasons no one could explain, diminished almost immediately after the final connection was made, as though the land had exhaled once the road became whole. But the silence was not peaceful. It was observational. The newly completed segment, the seam between the 341st and 93rd regiments, felt different from the rest of the highway. Men walking the convergence point described a faint tension underfoot, a subtle resistance in the soil, as if the ground remembered being forced to align. A private wrote in his notebook, "The earth here feels tired." Another wrote, "Like something was stretched into place." The army quickly moved to reinforce the convergence zone. Engineers added gravel, widened shoulders, drove fresh pilings deep into the soil. Commanders insisted it was simply to stabilize an unusually soft valley floor. Men who had been there knew better. They remembered the ripple, the stutter, the moment reality seemed to hesitate. And yet the work continued. Within a week, convoys began rolling over the newly completed section. Fuel trucks, supply carriers, radio jeeps. Men and equipment moved steadily northward, as if to prove the road's legitimacy through sheer repetition. But anomalies lingered, faint echoes of the months before. Engines droned with subtle harmonic undertones when idling near the convergence. Voices carried a little too far under certain winds. Compass needles jittered for a beat before settling. And during foggy mornings, the far end of the road sometimes appeared slightly misaligned until approached, as though the world needed a moment to load properly. Surveyors joked about it. Officers ignored it. But the men who built the road avoided standing on the exact convergence point for too long. Something about it felt thin. In the following weeks, letters written by engineers revealed deeper reflections. One wrote, "We built the road faster than we understood the land." Another, "Maybe the maps weren't wrong. Maybe the world reacts when you force a straight line across it." A third wrote a line that was quietly censored in the official archive. "Sometimes I think the ground was trying to tell us no." Historically, the Army celebrated the achievement. 2,700 kilometers of military highway completed in just 8 months. An engineering triumph, a strategic shield for Alaska, a lifeline to the northern frontier. But among the men who carved it from the wilderness, the legacy felt more complicated. They had built a road through unmapped terrain. A road through muskeg, mountains, rivers, permafrost, storms. A road through anomalies that no training manual had prepared them for. And though the final stretch now held firm beneath the weight of trucks and boots, its memory, the way it twisted, resisted, flickered, stayed with them. One officer captured it best in his final report. "This road is real. But there were moments I wasn't sure the land would let it be real." The northern winds returned. The forest closed in around the gravel. The machines quieted as autumn approached. And the Alcan Highway, improbable, unstable, monumental, settled into the wilderness like a scar across something ancient and indifferent. A line that should not have been possible. A line forced into existence. A line that still, on certain mornings, seems to waver ever so slightly at the edges of vision, as if remembering the cost of being made.